Okay, so you've sent over some really fascinating stuff about Brené Brown and her work on vulnerability. Looks like we're diving deep into this today.
Yeah, it's a rich topic for sure. Lots to unpack.
I think the goal here is to really distill it down to those core insights for our listeners, like how vulnerability actually connects to things like strength and courage and authenticity and, even leadership,
Yeah.
all without overwhelming anyone. We want those aha moments to stick.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of that is reframing how we even think about vulnerability.
Mm.
Because for so long, it's been seen as this weakness, right?
Right, like something to hide or something you have to overcome to be successful. But Brown kind of turns that on its head, doesn't she?
Oh, she totally flips the script.
Eh.
And it all starts with how she defines vulnerability, because it's not just about feeling exposed or uncertain. She says vulnerability is about having the courage to show up and be seen, even when you can't control the outcome.
It's about taking that risk.
Exactly.
And the material we have here really brings that to life with some great examples. Like, let's be honest, falling in love, that's a huge risk. Heartbreak potential is like built in.
Right. And starting a new business or, launching any kind of project.
Or even just asking for help when you need it.
Oh, for sure. Because that means admitting you don't know everything.
It's like you're revealing a potential weakness.
But here's the thing. Brown's research shows that in those situations, vulnerability isn't the problem. It's actually the key to achieving the positive outcomes.
It's the pathway.
Yeah. Like you can't experience real love without opening yourself up to the possibility of loss.
And you can't really innovate or create anything new without the risk of, being wrong or failing.
And building trust with anyone requires letting them see who you really are.
Or flower.
Flaws and all.
Oh.
Which, okay, I get it. A lot of people are going to hear that and think, yeah, but it feels like weakness.
Yeah.
Putting yourself out there like that is scary. It opens you up to potential hurt.
You're facing rejection, judgment, all that stuff. Right, it's not comfortable. So how do you make that leap?
Well, that's exactly what Brown's work challenges. That idea that vulnerability equals weakness.
So she's not saying it's easy.
No, not at all. What she's saying is that choosing to face that discomfort, choosing to be vulnerable despite the fear, that takes incredible strength.
So it's actually the opposite of weakness.
It really is. It's not about never being afraid. It's about acting anyway.
So you're saying vulnerability is at the core of courage.
Exactly. You can't be truly brave without being willing to be vulnerable.
So then the question becomes, okay, how do we actually start to embrace that? How do we get more comfortable with the discomfort of being authentic?
Right. Well, the material gives us some really practical advice. Like, first and foremost, just show up as you are.
Be yourself.
Yeah. Let people see the real you, imperfections and all.
So that might mean like voicing an opinion that's different, not just going along with the crowd.
Or admitting when you're unsure about something. Or, instead of putting on a brave face when you're struggling, expressing how you actually feel.
Like actually feeling your feelings.
Yeah, it's about taking off those masks we wear, letting go of that need to always appear perfect or like you have it all together.
And I think another piece that resonates with me is the idea of being willing to take risks.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be these huge, life-altering risks.
Yeah, you don't have to go quit your job and travel the world tomorrow.
Right. It could be as simple as applying for a job that seems a little out of reach.
Or finally starting that creative project you've been putting off. Or, having that difficult conversation you've been avoiding.
Or even just saying no to something when you need to protect your time and energy.
Right. Setting boundaries. And that kind of ties into this idea of accepting that we're not perfect, right? We're all going to make mistakes. And that's okay.
It's more than okay. It's essential. It's how we learn and grow.
We're human.
Exactly. We're all human. We're all imperfect. And that's a good thing. It's what makes us unique and interesting.
And one of the things that really struck me in the material was that quote about vulnerability being the birthplace of so many good things.
Oh, yeah. That's a powerful one.
It says vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, empathy, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity. If we want greater clarity in our purpose or deeper and more meaningful spiritual lives, vulnerability is the path.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack.
It really is. Just think about love and belonging. You can't really connect with someone deeply unless you let them see the real you.
And that means the good, the bad, and the messy parts.
Right. And even joy, like that feeling of pure happiness, often comes from those moments of deep connection and being truly present.
Yeah, and if you're constantly trying to protect yourself from vulnerability, you're also kind of blocking yourself from experiencing those really intense positive emotions.
You're putting up walls.
Exactly. And then you have courage and empathy, which are also closely tied to vulnerability.
Yeah.
Because courage means stepping into uncertainty.
Or taking that risk.
And empathy comes from being able to connect with another person's feelings, which is easier to do when we're in touch with our own vulnerabilities and recognize that we all share similar struggles.
And then there's creativity and innovation. I mean, think about putting any new idea out into the world.
It's inherently risky. You're putting yourself out there.
You're opening yourself up to criticism, potential failure.
And if you're constantly afraid of being vulnerable, you're less likely to take those creative leaps.
So it can actually stifle innovation.
Yeah, on a personal level and even on a societal level.
And then there's authenticity and purpose. You know, that feeling of living in alignment with your values and what truly matters to you.
And that often involves making tough choices,
Stepping outside your comfort zone.
navigating uncertainty.
So it's all connected.
It really is. The text sums it up beautifully, saying embracing that uncertainty and those messy feelings is actually a strength, not a weakness. It's the foundation for a truly meaningful life.
Okay, so we're seeing vulnerability as this key strength. But the material also points to a huge obstacle that often gets in the way, and that's shame.
Oh, yeah, shame is a big one.
I think we all experience it to some degree.
It's universal. It's that feeling of believing we're fundamentally flawed or unworthy.
And Brown makes a really important distinction between shame and guilt.
Yes, she does. And understanding that difference is so important because guilt is about our actions. It's that feeling of, I did something wrong.
Yeah.
And that can be uncomfortable, but it can also motivate us to make amends or change our behavior.
To do better next time.
Exactly. But shame is different. It's that feeling of, I am bad. It attacks our core sense of self. And it can be so much more corrosive and destructive, leading to feelings of worthlessness and disconnection.
So it makes it even harder to be vulnerable.
It shuts us down. Because if we believe we're fundamentally flawed, why would we risk putting ourselves out there?
It feels like too much of a risk.
Right. And the material lists a bunch of common shame triggers, things that tend to bring those feelings to the surface.
It's a pretty broad range. You know, things like perceived failures, body image stuff, financial struggles, addiction, trauma, mental health challenges, even just comparing ourselves to others.
Right. And it's interesting to think about what those triggers are for you personally.
For sure. So what can we do about it? How do we deal with shame?
Well, Brown's work offers a really helpful framework called shame resilience theory, or SRT. And it basically outlines 4 key elements for developing resilience to shame.
So it's like building a muscle.
Exactly. And the first step is recognizing when shame is present. Like, what does it feel like in your body? What are the thoughts and emotions that come up for you?
And do certain situations or interactions tend to trigger it?
Yes, noticing those patterns is crucial. And once you're aware of it, the second element is practicing critical awareness.
Which basically means questioning those shame messages, right?
Right. Like, are those expectations realistic? Are they aligned with your values?
Are they even your own expectations, or are they coming from somewhere else?
Exactly. It's about separating yourself from that harsh inner critic and really examining its claims.
Not just accepting them as truth.
Right. And then the third element is reaching out and sharing your story with someone you trust. Because shame thrives on secrecy and isolation.
Yeah, it's like it loses its power when you bring it out into the open.
Exactly. And as Brown says, if we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. So connecting with others in a vulnerable way is actually one of the most powerful antidotes to shame.
So it's kind of the opposite of what shame wants us to do.
It is. And then the final element of SRT is speaking shame.
Saying it out loud.
Yeah. Naming the feeling, whether it's to yourself or to a trusted person, just saying, I'm feeling ashamed right now.
Yeah.
Because sometimes just acknowledging it can help lessen its grip on you.
So it's like you're taking away some of its power.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that building shame resilience is an ongoing practice.
It's not a one-time fix.
No, it's about consistently showing up for yourself with compassion and developing those skills to navigate those difficult emotions.
So we've talked about shame as this barrier to vulnerability. But what's the positive force that allows vulnerability to flourish?
Authenticity.
Right, authenticity. And how does Brown define that?
She says it's the daily practice of letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are.
Which sounds a lot easier than it is.
It's definitely a journey. It's about having the courage to be imperfect, to set healthy boundaries, and to show up in the world as our true selves.
Warts and all.
Exactly. And this is all tied to her concept of wholehearted living.
Which is about.
It's about engaging with the world from a place of worthiness. That deep down belief that you are enough just as you are,
Even with all your imperfections.
especially with them. And it involves cultivating three key things: courage, compassion, and connection.
Courage to be vulnerable.
Yes, compassion for yourself and others, and connection that flows naturally from being your authentic self.
And there's that really powerful quote in the material that says, I am imperfect and vulnerable and sometimes afraid, but that doesn't change the truth, that I am also brave and worthy of love and belonging.
That's a great one to remember.
It really is. It's like an affirmation for embracing your whole self.
And it's the opposite of those shame-driven behaviors like perfectionism.
Which is all about trying to avoid criticism and appear flawless.
And it's exhausting because you can never be perfect.
And then there's people-pleasing, where you constantly put others' needs ahead of your own.
Which can really erode your self-trust and make it hard to know what you really want.
So authenticity is about pushing back against those patterns.
It is. It's about having the courage to say, this is who I am, this is what I value, and I am enough.
And that's a really powerful stance to take.
It is. It allows you to connect with others in a much more genuine and meaningful way.
So how do we actually cultivate this authenticity and resilience to shame?
Well, the text gives us some really practical tools, like practicing self-compassion.
Treating yourself with kindness.
Exactly, like you would a good friend. Recognizing that everyone makes mistakes, that we're all in this together. And also practicing mindfulness.
Which is about being present in the moment without judgment.
Yeah. And there's also the work of Dr. Kristen Neff, which really complements this beautifully.
And then there's the importance of knowing your values.
Oh, absolutely. Identifying what truly matters to you gives you that internal compass to guide your choices.
So you can make decisions that are aligned with who you are.
Even when it's tough or unpopular.
And then there's setting boundaries.
Oh, that's a big one. Learning to say no when you need to protect your time and energy.
Because that's an act of self-respect.
It is. And it's essential for maintaining your authenticity.
And it's also about breaking the silence around shame.
Right. Sharing your experiences with trusted people, creating that space for open and honest conversation.
Normalizing it.
Exactly. And finally, engaging in reality checking when those shame messages pop up.
Questioning those negative thoughts.
Yeah. And trying to adopt a more compassionate and balanced perspective.
Okay, so we've talked about vulnerability as a strength and how authenticity helps us overcome shame and be more vulnerable. But how does this translate into action?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Because Brown's work highlights how vulnerability is essential for courage, connection, and even leadership.
It's not just a concept, it's something we live out.
Exactly. And she emphasizes that courage isn't about not feeling fear.
It's about acting despite the fear.
Right. And vulnerability is almost always a part of that equation.
And the text gives some great examples of this in everyday life. Like, think about having a difficult conversation with someone.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic one.
The easy way out is to avoid it, right?
Yeah.
But the courageous thing to do is to have that conversation.
To express yourself honestly, to listen openly.
And that takes vulnerability.
It does. And the same goes for setting boundaries. It might be easier to say yes to everything and try to please everyone, but the courageous and ultimately more respectful thing to do is to state your limits clearly.
To protect your own well-being.
Right. And then there's asking for what you need, or trying something new where you might fail.
Or speaking your truth, even when it's unpopular.
All of those things require vulnerability.
And while they might be uncomfortable in the moment, they often lead to deeper connections and personal growth in the long run.
Yeah. You're building trust and authenticity.
And then there's this idea of vulnerable leadership, which really challenges the traditional models of leadership.
It does. It turns the whole idea of the strong, stoic leader on its head.
Because Brown's research suggests that vulnerability isn't a weakness for leaders, it's actually a strength.
It's essential for building trust and fostering a healthy, innovative team culture.
So think about a leader who's willing to admit when they've made a mistake.
That's huge, because it shows they're human.
And it models accountability.
Right. It creates a culture where it's okay to not be perfect.
And what about a leader who's willing to say, I don't know?
Oh, that's so powerful. Because it gives others permission to do the same. It creates a more collaborative and learning-oriented environment.
See, you're not expected to have all the answers all the time.
No. And that fosters curiosity and innovation.
And then there are leaders who are willing to ask for help when they need it, who give and receive honest feedback, even when it's tough.
who create that psychological safety where people feel comfortable taking risks and admitting when they've messed up.
So it's all about creating a more human and relatable work environment.
It is. It's about shifting from that old power over people dynamic to power with people.
And building trust through vulnerability.
Exactly. And the research shows that this style of leadership actually leads to better outcomes,
More creativity.
more engagement from employees.
And a more resilient organizational culture.
It makes sense. When leaders are willing to be open and authentic, it gives everyone else permission to do the same.
And then there's this fundamental human need for connection.
Right? We all want to feel like we belong.
And the text really highlights how vulnerability is the key ingredient for building those deep, meaningful relationships.
It's the bridge that connects us.
I mean, think about your closest relationships. They're not based on perfection, are they?
No, they're about navigating life's ups and downs together,
Supporting each other through the tough times.
being real with each other.
And that requires vulnerability.
Absolutely. It creates trust because when someone is open with you, you naturally feel more inclined to trust them in return.
And it fosters empathy because you can relate to their struggles through your own experiences.
And it creates that sense of belonging, of being accepted for who you are, flaws and all.
So it's about choosing authenticity over the need for approval.
Choosing courage over comfort.
And trusting that the possibility of real connection is worth the risk. So we're seeing how vulnerability plays out in our work lives, our relationships. But what about in our everyday lives? You know, those smaller, more mundane moments.
Yeah, it shows up there too. And the text gives some really relatable examples, like think about asking for help when you're struggling with something.
Which can be hard.
It can be.
Yeah.
But that act of admitting you need support, even though it might feel like you're exposing a weakness, can actually lead to getting the help you need.
And it can strengthen your relationships.
Because it shows you trust the other person.
Yeah.
And it also normalizes the idea that we all need help sometimes.
And then they're saying, I don't know, or I made a mistake.
Oh, yeah, that can be tough, especially in a professional setting.
But being honest about those things can actually build trust.
It shows humility.
And it creates a more open and learning-oriented environment.
And then there's loving without guarantees.
Which is basically what all love is, right?
Yeah, it is. It means putting your heart out there, even though there's always the risk of rejection or getting hurt.
But the potential reward is that deep connection and intimacy.
Yeah. And then there's setting boundaries, which can be uncomfortable because you might worry about disappointing someone. But it's ultimately about protecting your own well-being and creating more honest and respectful relationships.
And for anyone who's ever put their creative work out there, you know, shared a piece of writing or art or music,
That's a huge act of vulnerability.
because you're opening yourself up to criticism.
But you're also creating the possibility for connection and impact,
And even if it doesn't go the way you hoped, you're still putting yourself out there.
which is an act of courage in itself.
And the text also acknowledges why this can be so hard sometimes.
Yeah, there are a lot of obstacles. Like we all have that fear of rejection, that deep down need to belong.
And shame can make it even harder.
Definitely. And then there's the constant comparison trap where we're measuring ourselves against other people's highlight reels.
And the cultural myth of this self-sufficient individual, like we're not supposed to need anyone.
Which is totally unrealistic. We all need each other.
And then there are past experiences of betrayal or hurt that can make it hard to trust.
Or family or cultural norms that discourage emotional expression.
And sometimes it's just not knowing what healthy vulnerability looks like.
Right. We might not have had good role models for that.
So acknowledging all of these obstacles helps us understand why choosing vulnerability can feel so difficult sometimes.
And why it's such an act of courage when we do choose it.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about this idea of transformation, like how we can move from a place of fear and protection to a place of greater personal power through embracing vulnerability.
This is where it all comes together. And the text introduces this concept of emotional armor.
Like we're suiting up for battle.
In a way, yeah. It's all those protective thoughts and behaviors we develop to shield ourselves from potential pain.
But ultimately, it ends up holding us back.
Exactly. And it can manifest in so many ways, like perfectionism, where we're constantly striving to be flawless to avoid criticism.
Or numbing our feelings, which also numbs our joy.
And then there's foreboding joy, where we can't fully enjoy the good moments because we're waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Oh, I know that one well.
And then there's cynicism and criticism, which can be a way of detaching and protecting ourselves.
We're trying to control everything in our lives to avoid uncertainty.
And people-pleasing, where we sacrifice our own needs to gain approval,
We're always needing to be right, the knower.
and even just suppressing our emotions instead of processing them healthily.
So all of these are forms of armor.
They are. And while they might provide a temporary sense of safety, in the long run, they prevent us from really living fully and connecting authentically with others.
They keep us stuck.
They do. So shedding that armor isn't about becoming defenseless. It's about replacing that rigid protection with healthier boundaries and a willingness to express ourselves authentically.
And that's what leads to true freedom.
It is. And Brown argues that real personal power doesn't come from control or perfection. It comes from authenticity and worthiness.
So it's an inside job.
It is. And when we shift from letting fear drive our choices to making decisions based on our values, that's when we tap into our true power.
Because vulnerability allows us to act with integrity,
To be accountable for our actions
to have self-respect.
and to show up with courage and compassion.
And when we embrace our imperfections, we learn from our mistakes and become more resilient.
And authenticity builds trust, both in ourselves and in our relationships.
And shame resilience gives us the power to choose how we respond to our experiences.
This is about agency
And integrity,
and impact.
not dominance or control.
Right. And this idea of vulnerability as a source of power extends beyond just our individual lives.
It can have a ripple effect.
It can, because collective vulnerability can drive social change.
Think about movements that are challenging stigma around mental health
Or working to build more inclusive communities.
or fighting for social justice.
All of those things require people to be vulnerable and share their stories.
And that can shift cultural norms and create real change.
That's pretty amazing to think about.
It is. So to bring it all home for our listeners, the key message here is that vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's a strength.
And embracing it, even when it's scary, is the key to living a more authentic, courageous, and connected life.
So as you're listening to this, maybe think about one area in your own life where you could lean into vulnerability a little more.
What would it look like to take a small risk? To be a little more open and honest with yourself or someone you trust? Just notice what happens.
And if you're interested in learning more about Brené Brown's work, I highly recommend checking out her books and talks.
There's so much wisdom there.
Thanks for sharing these sources with us and for joining us on this deep dive today.
It's been a great conversation.
It has. We hope it's given you some valuable food for thought.
Absolutely.
Until next time.
Take care.